Hi, everybody. This is On, and I am coming to you with, well, part 3 of A Triple Threat for America. And Code Warriors, man, this is quite a series that I'm putting forth, and it's very interesting because I started off with the first part dealing with immigration, since that was the big news topic of the month. And then other pieces, of course, came into that and opened up the aspects of re-education and how the socialism is working with other aspects of communist formulas and plans and agendas. And it opened up doors to looking at the CCP, and it opened up the doors to looking in the education system, which was kind of coming out this month too. So it led to this 3-part series that we're in here, and this is part 3. And this 3-part series is looking at immigration, re-education, and infiltration. And what's interesting is, even though these are 3 very different components, I'm hoping that in this particular video, the part 3 series, that you're going to see how some of the other pieces that we've already talked about, the immigration and things like that, play into these ideologies, play into these thought systems, these power controls. And the codes have talked a lot about power controls over last year, this year. We're kind of in this big phase where we keep going in and out of these control battles and these desires for control, and people who are using their power wisely and not using their power wisely, and how that's bringing the rise and the fall of leaders in different countries. And you know, of course, if you haven't gotten your Code Journey book, you might want to check that out. But I certainly will welcome comments if you want to put them in the comment sections of the videos. And, you know, if you're enjoying what you're seeing, let me know. Let me know if you like the information that's being covered. Make a comment on it. Make sure you subscribe to the channel and, you know, like the video, because all of those things help us get the word out there. Content creators like myself, people that are trying to help people understand what's really happening in our world, because I think too often people are brought into these thought systems in very subtle ways, thinking that they're doing something good, when in reality they're supporting something that is very, very destructive in our world. So are you ready? Shall we jump into this part 3? We've got quite a bit of information to cover, and I know this has been a really big series. Each part has had a pretty good chunk of information in it, and it's a lot of information to take into the brain. But I do encourage you, with the resources that I'll share in this video, that you go in and you delve a little deeper and you get some of the full parts of them in there and open that up. So let me come right in here where I can share my screen with you, and we can go into some of these components and these pieces. And as I jump right over here, the first thing I want to start with is this information from the Indo-Pacific Defense Forum, and that website is ipdefenseforum.com. And they really get into, on their site, helping us to understand a little bit about the CCP threat, because I think a lot of people, especially in America and some of the countries like America or who operate in similar ways, they don't really understand the threat of the CCP. Now, if you go back to people that were born 100 years ago, they have a little better understanding of it. You know, when you get into your older generations, they understand because they've lived through times where they've had to face these things throughout their history. And so oftentimes we don't understand it, because people in America, for example, look at it and see it, you know, hey, we're the land of opportunity. Let's just, you know, let people through. And I talked about this a bit in the immigration part of this series. But on this particular page that I've got pulled up here, it shares information from a national security expert, David Maxwell, and he is exposing some of the Chinese Communist Party tactics for gaining influence, because they do it in these really subtle ways. They like to bring it in ways that seem humanitarian or seem like it's going to be for something good. And then it's like, once they get their grip in there, it's really hard to get out of that grip. It's really hard to, remove ourselves from it, which is why we need to do what we can to not allow that grip to take total control. And this is why America is in such a precarious state right now, and they really have to stand up for their rights or their freedoms, because what sounds good and some of these things, as I talked about in the last part, the equality and things like that, are really, really destructive, and people are going to end up with something very different than what they've been told or believe that they're getting. So this retired U.S. Army Colonel, David Maxwell, he had delivered a keynote address on during the Trans-Regional Resistance Working Group Conference at the Naval Postgraduate School in Monterey, California. And this was about a little over a year ago, February 2020. And he was speaking mostly to Special Operations Forces personnel. So that's your people that deal in political warfare and things like that. And he started to share the tactics that are used by the Communist Party and the People's Republic of China, because here again, most people don't realize that this is really one of the greatest threats that we have to our country here in America. And we need to be able to create some counter moves for them. We need to be able to come up with some opportunities on how to deal with this. And so Maxwell served 30 years in the U.S. Army, by the way, before he retired in 2011 as a Special Forces colonel. And his final assignment was on the military faculty teaching national security strategy at the National War College. So he specialized in China, military and political power, North Korea and the U.S., defense and policy strategy. So he's got a lot of big information on this, and he says it's really critical for the Special Operations Forces to understand the region's fundamental problem. And he identifies that as the PRC, which is, directly connected into the CCP. And more specifically, he says the CCP is that big threat, and that they seek to undermine the U.S. and Western influence and the influence of individual freedom and liberty, liberal democracy, free market economy, and human rights and human dignity of all. So they want to undermine all of that. They want to tear that down, is what he's saying here. And these common values the U.S. and other like-minded countries share. So, here again, U.S. is like the big gold prize, so to say. If they could tear these things down in the U.S., then they can do it in any other country. And this is part of why they're coming after the U.S., and they've been lining this up for quite a while. And he says we should all take time in some of these things, and he kind of starts down. But I want to get down to this part down here, where he really gets into identifying and understanding CCP warfare strategies. And this is really important. And he talks about there's three key warfares that they use, and that's a psychological warfare, which seeks to disrupt an opponent's decision-making capacity, that creates doubts, it foments anti-leadership sentiments, and deceive and diminish the will to fight among opponents. Legal warfare, or lawfare, and that can involve enacting domestic law as the basic basis for making claims in international law and employing bogus maps to justify PRC actions. And then media warfare. And truthers have been bringing this out. You've heard me talk about it in a couple of different videos about how the media is manipulated and how the media is something that is not there to share the truth. They're sharing these agendas. They're there sharing propaganda. They're there being puppets to these different things that they want to put in place. And they consider media warfare as the key to gaining dominance over the venue for implementing psychological and legal warfare. So media warfare is really their platform. And when we look at that, where do we see that playing out? We see that playing out in the censorship, like on Facebook and Twitter, and we see that where the main news stations are reporting certain narratives instead of just actually reporting the truth in things. And then he goes on to share that the PRC, or the People's Republic of China investment schemes, are shaping the conversation on the CCP threat. And they do that through what's called One Belt, One Road, and the economic strategy that's behind that, which causes debt traps for vulnerable countries. Sri Lanka went through this with them, gained control of the PRC, gained controlling interest of its major port. And this is not happening just in Asia, but it's happening in Latin America and Africa as well. And we need to understand, he goes on to say, we need to understand the CCP investment strategies and the industries in which it invests are really important. And sure, it makes this economic sense, but it's also this power play. This is why they come in and they try to pick up and own companies or own aspects that companies have to work through. So, for example, you have AT&T has been kind of taken over by them, and what happens is instead of AT&T using, say, American products or things like that, then they'll go through a company like Huawei, which is basically owned, or an asset of the CCP. And so they go in and they make these investments, whether that's in land, whether that's in businesses, whether they invest in a business. And, they used to be able to skirt some of this around, and I've talked about it in some of the things in the past, where they could come in and they could say, well, it's an American company, but be an investor in it. And so, I'll talk about this a little bit later, where Mike Pompeo was one of those from the Trump administration who came in and said, oh, no, if you're even an investor, that's not going to work, because this is compromising our infrastructure. This is, compromising the country's security. So it's really important that we understand some of these subtle ways that they try to come in. And the CCP investment strategies and the industries in which it invests, here again, it makes this economic sense, but it takes all of the benefits of that and doesn't really give anything back in return. So in a place, for example, like Taiwan, it's made major investments to achieve controlling ownership of media companies. And we should ask, is this purely for profit, or does this provide the CCP with important capabilities? And of course, we know the answer to that. If you go in and you buy up the media companies and you're the controlling ownership on those companies, the controlling financial person in those companies, you now have power over what the information is that they disperse. And they will come in and force those companies to disperse the information they want, to tear down the narratives that they don't want, to black things out, all of these types of things. So the CCP also influences campaigns, infiltrating networks and communities, and that's really widespread. We're starting to find this out as we've been unfolding the campaigns in our own countries, and other countries are finding this out at this time. And they'll recruit spies, and they'll implement espionage operations, and they have just thousands of talents and people just scattered and designed to gather information and to put information out there. The Confucius Institutes, I'm going to get into those a little bit later too, provide money to cities and towns and school districts in return for providing education in Chinese language, culture, and history. They really came under scrutiny last year, and like I said, I've got some information on that I'm going to get into. And so they kind of say, oh, look how we're sharing diversity and teaching people about our language and our culture and our history. But, what they don't share is that it's funded by the CCP. In the end, as you get, down the line through things, you see that the CCP is an investor in this, or local governments become addicted to these funds. These organizations and the governments, they become addicted to the funds that the CCP gives them, and then they're controlled. Once they take those funds, they've pretty much sold out. And that allows the PRC to conduct aggressive influence operations at very grassroots levels is what it does. They've got a huge, vast intelligence network, he goes on to say, which is very true. They've infiltrated governments, militaries, businesses, the media, non-governmental organizations. I mean, that's a lot right there. This is this kind of dark web that we talk about being out there when we talk about this infiltration. So they're coming in and they're getting their people in all these different areas. And you might not notice it because it might not be somebody in a Chinese body, but their ideology is put in. Their practices, their principles are put in. And why? Because they pretty much own these people. They hold them in hostage through blackmail techniques. They'll have videotapes on them doing things. There's, I believe I've discussed this in a couple of videos in the past where they'll tape them doing something, and if they don't do what they want to have the video collateral, they go ahead and kill them, or they'll threaten them, or other things like this. So they hold a lot of components and pieces on there, and it's really difficult to keep information, he says here, from the CCP, and this is true, because they have eyes everywhere. They're in everything. They have people everywhere. And, you know, we'll see more how this happens, but, you know, they start in this grassroots level of, yeah, make sure you report your neighbor for not doing this. Make sure you report people going into a business for not wearing a mask, things like that. These are their people at a grassroots level, whether they realize it or not. They're being implemented and used in this process. So he says this can have a positive benefit because the development of resistance capabilities and resilience in society will show the CCP that its strategy is not working. So this is why they most want America, but they're also most afraid of America, because Americans in general are not just going to lay down and say, yeah, take over my life. You've got enough Americans who are like, oh, no, yeah, you're not doing that here. And so they develop this resistance and resilience from those citizens coming up. So it's a really interesting point for them to be at. And it kind of gives leaders, you know, maybe a pause for pursuing something, or, you know, shifting to more violent operations and actions, which we could see in riots and things like that, that are brought forth from some of the branches that come off or are controlled or connected to the CCP. And so we really need to think about the political processes that we have and what they're doing and what the people that are in our political positions are putting forth. And we know that, you know, he goes on to talk about some of these actions and things. And then he goes on to share about the CCP attempts to use movies and gaming to control the narrative. And this is a really big thing. And I notice that even, you know, sometimes I'll just, you know, play a game here or there because I just need to let my mind decompress and not really think about anything. And they'll do it. And now every time I see a movie, every time I play a game, or even if it's like a word Scrabble type game, which, you know, kind of opens my mind up and gets it functioning in certain ways, the words that pop up in those games, for example, are not just random words. I mean, they'll actually infiltrate into those programs so that you're seeing certain terminology or certain words coming up that they want you to connect with. But yeah, this is really interesting, and he says that we've seen the CCP censorship of Hollywood movies such as Red Dawn. That was a movie, I know that movie from way back. Jessie sure knew it from her times, and most people that are in their 50s now remember that movie Red Dawn and had seen it. And what they did was they made them censor that so that the enemy had to be changed from the PRC to North Korea. So you see this kind of deflection thing going on. Let's make North Korea look like the bad guy because they're our enemy instead of it being us. And so then it would pull people's attention away from that. But one of the most insidious influences, he says, ever conducted is the Chinese takeover of the gaming industry. Think about how much games have been pushed, especially on the 30 and under generation or the 35 and under generation. Well, there's even ones that are older than that, but think of how much gaming industry is, how big that is, how massive that is. I mean, think of how they specially do computers for gaming computers now. And they look at this, particularly where they get people into the rooms and they're partaking of massive multiplayer online gaming, championship games. The amount of people watching is, they say sometimes in some of these gaming communities, they have more people watching than the Super Bowl, which is crazy when you think about it. So they really have this big captive audience, and then they use those games to shape and to bring out the CCP narratives within them. So Chinese character heroes and favorable descriptions of the PRC versus negative portrayals of the U.S. and the West. And this shapes the whole next generation of our youth. So when they're sitting there playing these games, it's shaping and shifting their brain into the programming of the PRC or the CCP. And, it doesn't matter. They're not trying to promote truth or right information or correct information. Matter of fact, they're happy to promote false information through those games and propaganda. So, the question we have to start asking is, how do we resist this, and how to develop the resiliency to counteract this? And it comes back to things like kids need to be limited on these gaming times. They need to be shifted to doing outdoor activities more and physical activities more, and opening to learning about the environment and environmental programs and things like that, that they can actually learn how things work for themselves versus just being on the computer. And these computers are addicting and programming. And then now, of course, we've also had things come up about the commercials that come in and between the games, which are highly sexual and that are child pornography, predatory, and things along that line. So you have a whole bunch of other things. Then he goes on to share about the coronavirus pandemic has unmasked elements of the CCP influence tactics. And so this is interesting because Trump called this out an awful lot along the way. And to look at how the coronavirus changes the PRC strategy. So, he says we're not sure exactly what happened, and he doesn't want to be a conspiracy theorist and just say, they were developing a bioweapon, but we all kind of know at this point that was the case. But we do understand there was a bio lab 30 miles from Wuhan. And in fact, the bio experts have told this guy that it makes no sense to use this type of virus as a bioweapon. However, it may not have been deliberate. Perhaps it was an accident in the lab, or perhaps it was some kind of test that went wrong, or maybe it was a deliberate test to see the response and the reaction, or perhaps deplete resources on a global scale. So it really has this kind of multi-purpose thing to see how they were going to use it. And if it was a deliberate act, then the PRC appears to already be suffering some sort of blowback from it, is what he's estimating. For example, when the stock market reopened and it had lost billions of dollars in value, and if this was deliberate, again, what do we do about it? How do we, not exploit things, but how do we find the balance? How do we get to the truth of it? And it's obvious that even if it wasn't deliberate, the Chinese reaction to the problem illustrates the vulnerability of authoritarian regimes. So the lack of transparency allowed the virus to spread, and the Chinese system is not one designed to take care of the people. It's a system designed to protect and to keep people in power, and CCP at the expense of its people. So that should be a key theme and message in any information and influence activities deal. So he's kind of, showing this. It's kind of it's this mixed messages, and of course the codes talk about this a lot, right? Your misuse of power, it's going to backfire on you. You could take a harder fall, and you might not get that win that you're thinking of. That came up over and over and over again over the last year when all of this stuff was coming out. That was all present in the codes. And he goes on to talk about how countries should consider certain things when developing counter approaches, and going into that, and a paradigm shift is needed. And but you know, he talks about there's really three options for a country that's facing the PRC's political warfare strategy, and that is accept and give into it. So you just bow down to, you know, what they want, and you accept their investment, their influence, and that's going to undermine the government's legitimacy and lead to the PRC's objective of creating instability and insecurity. You can create a civil military resistance capability to defend your country. You can develop a civil military resistance and conduct a counter-subversion campaign and actively subvert the hostile power. And I do believe that Trump was trying to, in many ways, work with this counter-subversion campaign tactic in things. So there's, you know, your three elements to resist and resiliency that we need to focus on, and resilience of governments and institutions to withstand these attacks on their legitimacy. So, you know, this is where our infrastructure comes in. We have to get strong people in positions of power that aren't going to bow down to the CCP and to their plans and their agendas and things like that, which is, you know, again, something Trump pushed over and over again. We've got to get strong people in. We got to, you know, we got to remove these people who are compromised, who are selling us out along the way. And then he talks about a paradigm shift needed to happen. And in order to do that, we have to change our mindset. We have to take what he calls a campaign approach rather than a preparation approach. And that's one option of things. And then the second thing he says is we need to attack the Chinese strategy. And the first step in that is to expose the strategy. And we need to bring sunshine on it to inform and educate and influence the population. And that, you know, here again, we see that Trump did a lot of that. He was doing a lot of shining the light on the corruption, a lot of shining the light on these strategies and what people were doing. And he called things out that we're seeing now. He called them out 2, 3, 4 years ago, even before his presidency. He was calling them out, saying we need to pay attention to these things. We need to watch out for these things. And in doing that, we can start to inoculate people, or we can start to help them stand strong against that strategy so that they can recognize it, take measures to not succumb to it and not become a part of it. And he talks about we have to develop an aggressive or comprehensive and sophisticated information and influence activity campaigns to counter Chinese propaganda. So, you know, you have to, this is that moves and that counter moves things that we hear a lot of that going on, and you've got to get the correct information out there once you've got the incorrect stuff exposed along the way. So, you know, there's a lot of measures that he talks about, you know, coming into play and working on countering these things. And this other piece where they work with allies and partners, we have to join together. We have to work with one another, which is why there was so much of a focus in the Trump administration on bringing in this kind of world peace aspect of getting countries to work harmoniously together, because it's only when we come together, when we create allies, that we can counter the CCP, because their organization has become incredibly massive in their numbers, incredibly massive in things. So moving on here, we want to take a little look. I pulled this up from the Wentworth report, and this is taking a look at political warfare. And what is political warfare? Because this is a big piece used by the CCP. And what it is, he describes it here as unrestricted warfare using every means just short of a large-scale military combat. In essence, the PRC says that everything legal or illegal is permissible in order to achieve its ends. Specific examples the PRC gives of how to conduct its unrestricted warfare include biological and chemical warfare and terrorism means particularly pertinent to note and consider in the COVID-19 era, right? So they're okay with chemical warfare. They're okay with terrorism. They're okay with biological warfare. They have no problem doing these things, and it doesn't matter whether it's legal or illegal to them. It's all fair as long as they come out the winner, as long as they end up with what they want in the end. So they don't care how many lives they destroy in the meantime. And the list of weapons that the PRC employs is long, he says. It includes propaganda, psychological warfare, media warfare, disinformation, corruption, economic and sexual enticement and coercion. It also includes active measures such as hybrid warfare, proxy armies, assassination, kidnapping, and brutal physical attacks. The PRC's PW doctrine also includes concepts such as lawfare, which is using international and national laws, bodies, and courts to shape decision-making in the CCP's favor. We're seeing that in America. We're seeing that huge in America right now. Cyber attacks, we're seeing that all over the world. Terrorism, espionage, bribery, censorship, deception, subversion, blackmail, enforced disappearances, kidnappings, abductions. You know, most of these things where we see these attacks on people and people who aren't suicidal that suddenly commit suicide, for example, we see the kids go missing, these sorts of things happening. We see the increase in the pedophile aspects. This is all part of the ploys that the PRC and the CCP are using. And these are the things that we want to do. They encourage attacks by the criminal gangs. You know, we talk about Soros being heavily involved, and that's because Soros runs under the same ideology. It runs parallel to this ideology. And, you know, that's where some of these fundings come from. Also, the CCP is funding some of these organizations and things. And how much of this woke is just Chinese propaganda? You know, we've heard about the woke culture coming in, and they use social media a lot. The PRC does, to amplify this kind of psychological warfare, this intimidation, coercion, propaganda, you know, getting people to think a certain way. They send their people in much the way you have the bots that follow you and make responses to things and aggravate arguments and come in and keep posting their propaganda in different posts and things like that, or they'll call out political figures or people who are speaking up in ways that don't match what the CCP wants and things. So media is a big thing with them. It's a big way for them to spread disinformation. It's a big way for them to put out their propaganda, to weaken people's faith in democracy, create political instability. I mean, look at what happened in the U.S. Like, how many people have just said, I've lost faith in the elections. I've lost faith in things. I can't trust any of my political leaders type of thing. So they seek to have the social media dominance is what they seek to have, and they establish what they call a PLA cyber force, which has about 300,000 soldiers in it. Think about that. And you know, this is kind of equivalent to what they call the 50-cent army, or a netizen 50-cent army, which has perhaps 2 million individuals. And these individuals, what they are is they're paid people. They get a fee to go online, to be on the social media sites, and to make comments that support the CCP propaganda and to coerce people into different ways of thinking. For example, like saying, you know, look at how this is white supremacy. Look at, you know, your whiteness. Look at BLM things and stuff like that. So they pay this massive network of people to go out there and to make comments on posts. And that's what they do, and comments that are going to support what the CCP wants. And they, so they do that in conjunction with these other things, and they use it to intimidate people, to knock people down who are sharing the truth, to coerce people, to, they'll utilize things like national corporations, celebrities, governments, organizations, anything, pretty much anything. It's pretty massive, and it's pretty interesting in some ways at the same time how they bring this about. And, so they have this politicians and media dance to the tune of social media, he says. It's all part of their totalitarian thought control is what he brings up in this article, which is so true. It's all part of it. They have all these different components. It's not just one path, not just one way through. And so this is really about coercion and thought control tactics to force people into a certain way of thinking, to break down their minds, to break down their faith, to break down their hope, to break down their spirit. And when they do this, then the mind will just take in whatever they want. They just end up surrendering to these lies and these distortions and these things that they're putting forth. And so, I mean, this has been a big attack that I don't even think most people have really paid that much attention to or been that conscious about in it, and now it's just become kind of routinely applied. So as we move on here, we have another piece from the IP Defense Forum, which talks about the CCP's global political expansion in things, and why the Chinese Communist Party became a responsible stakeholder. And they get into some of these different pieces and looking at, this comprehensive power that they kind of have, and the combination of the CCP's power is a combination, they say, of the communist idea system and practice with Chinese history and traditions and cultures. So they're mixing these things together. It's very similar to mixing truth and lies together, and you put enough truth in there or enough of the good stuff in there to get people interested and to follow, but then you lock them into all the lies in the process. And, they mention, of course, the big influencers in the CCP party come from Karl Marx, Vladimir Lenin, and Mao Zedong, and Xi Jinping. And I hope, I forgive me if I have pronounced those incorrectly. I'm not versed in that language, so I may not be the best at pronouncing those particular names. But the communist goals, they still come down to some of these same basic things, which is to dominate the heights of economic and control the means of production through a dictatorship of the proletariat led by the party. And so really they want to have this political, this economical control. They want to control the production of products and things in the world. So if they have total control of this, they'll have total control of people. If they control the money systems, if they control the banks, if they control the food chains, if they all the supply chains, they've got control of everybody. And this just becomes a dictatorship. Anytime you centralize things, anytime you bring them into one type of rulership, you start running into dictatorships, you start running into totalitarianism and things. And they go on to say that the CCP's implemented a social system with Chinese characteristics to carry out the communist ideas. And so right now, at this point, the CCP is the largest communist party on the planet. They've managed to develop up from, they started with like 12 members or something like that, and they now have 90 million members in the main party and another 80 million members of the Communist Youth League, which is just crazy. That's 170 million people, and to put that in perspective, that's almost half of the entire population of the United States. So that is a pretty massive amount of people, and those are the people that are actively involved in it. that doesn't even account for the people who don't even know that they're involved in it, who are supporting it. And so they become the sole leadership of the country when they do this. And, you know, this is how they've kind of gotten the control that they've gotten to. And according to the Constitution of the PRC and the Constitution of the CCP controls the entire country of China through its organization, its ideology, and coercive force. And we're seeing these things come forth in our world, right? If you don't wear a mask, you can't walk in the store. If you don't get a vaccine, you can't go into a sporting event or a concert, or you can't fly. This is coerciveness. This is how coerciveness works. And it's not a choice, and it's not voluntary. It's the removal of rights, as I've talked about in previous videos. So this gives them advantages when they're competing with the U.S. because they are the largest corporation of state capitalism, and it's, you know, developed these different practices and pieces that put them into place. And the CCP actually has concrete plans for fulfilling its goal, which is called the China Dream, and that was proposed by the CCP General Secretary Xi Jinping in the 19th National Congress of the CCP in 2017. So in 2017, this was put forth for him, and it calls for achieving 2 100s. The material goal of the PRC is to become moderately well-off society by 2021. Well, isn't that interesting, because that's right when Biden took office, right? And, you know, they may have had a little glitches in the system with Trump being in there for 4 years, because they were planning on having it be Obama and then Hillary Clinton and then Biden. And Trump kind of threw a wrench in the system, I think, there on that. And they have the goal of the PRC to become a fully developed nation by 2049. Well, that's very interesting, because that plays into the New World agendas, the globalist plans, the ones that are set forth with Gates and the sustainable cities being in place by 2050, but those have gotten bumped up and moved into the 2030 agenda, which is interesting, because China aims, the Made in China 2025 aims to replace the U.S. as the leading position in science and technology. And so this kind of also goes hand in hand with that 2030 agenda. And the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank and other regional multilateral banks led by China are all part of the CCP's attempt to challenge the supremacy, the rule of the U.S. And this is where we're seeing all of this start to culminate, why we're seeing these kind of attacks on the U.S., why we're seeing this heavy emphasis to infiltrate the U.S. on things. And so there's all of these little pieces and these policies that are being put into place to be able to manifest these different components that they want to implement. And one of Xi's goals, they go on to say here, is to drive the U.S. out of Asia and destroy U.S. alliances in the region. Right now, the PRC is already global, so they're already got their foot in the door all around the world. The Chinese military has broken out of the first island chain of major archipelagos and from the Eastern Asian continental mainland coast, and is breaking through the second island chain and component of the CCP's 3-island chain strategy. In coming decades, the intensive competition between the two countries is going to be largely in the Indo-Pacific region. And we're starting to see that, right? We're starting to see that with things that we've seen with Korea, North Korea, Japan coming into play. And so, you know, they kind of go on to say they have the same goal but different strategies. And the China Dream is the CCP's objective, but it's used different strategies at different points. The goal has always been the same, but the strategy maybe has adjusted to the times and how they've implemented things. And after Xi came into power in 2012, he tried to develop a new model of great power relations with the U.S. Well, that was when Obama was in office, while accelerating global expansion through economic aid, military expansion, exporting China politics, and these politics, along with the changes in the U.S. policy that were being made under the Biden-Obama administration, especially trade policy that accompanied the administration, that accompanied these different administrations. And then, of course, Trump came in, and they had trade policies there that were coming up. And, of course, Trump decided to sanction, and start coming down on China with things, which is, it's definitely stirred some things up. There's no doubt about it. Things that probably need to be stirred up, because if Trump hadn't come along and stirred some things up, we could have just very easily been consumed by China completely. We would pretty much already be there, and that's a big thing. They want to hit back, and they're not happy with some of the things, and Trump wasn't happy about some of the things, and so it's been an interesting journey, shall we say. Now, in this part, they go on to say that Xi has publicly abandoned the low-profile foreign policy and is ready to implement tooth-for-tooth foreign policy. The CCP could promise a lot during negotiations to reach its strategic goal, but it could also break its promises anytime. And Xi, for example, promised former U.S. President Barack Obama in 2015 that he would not militarize the artificial islands created atop coral reefs in the South China Sea, but he had done so by the end of 2016. So it's more important to see their deeds than their words, because their words are not trustworthy. What they tell you is not trustworthy. They have no problem lying. They have no problem telling you whatever they think you want to hear to get you into their control. And this is part of how they work. And they've got they go on to talk about different weapons that they have for survival, and that's not necessarily military weapons, but again, that's implementing these different pieces, these aspects of infiltration, these aspects of having reign over people in government and things like that. So they've kind of implemented these different pieces along the way, and it's always worth, you can go in and you can read the full articles on this, and then they get into the global propaganda of things, and how they've kind of pushed things through, and it's about the China dreams about reclaiming the nation's power and the global position in the world industry, and it just kind of goes on and on and on in these things. So there's an awful lot there when you get down into it. And, they get into even inciting nationalism against the West and CCP loyalty. And we really kind of saw some of that come up in the virus as well. It was testing what governors, what mayors around the U.S. were going to hold to CCP loyalty and what the CCP wanted in protocols and procedures and mandates and things like that. We've seen that coming up as well, and we're in what the codes have said, a big fight for power, in this, and it goes on and on and on and on. Now, an interesting piece that came up was that I was finding while I was working in things is the CCP and how it's working with AI, and this is part of how they want to move themselves into this bigger power, how they want to move themselves into this technology aspect, and they want to use AI to help them enslave people, basically. And I don't know if any of you have heard of Cyrus Parsa, but he was the founder of the AI organization, and he talks about how AI is being used and how it's being used to further the CP and things, and he's put out a book on it, and this is the AIorganization.com website, which is his organization. And he says the purpose of the organization was to assess any risks or dangers and give consultation to the threats of artificial intelligence and anything related to it, such as 5G, 6G, grid systems, quantum technology, bioengineering, robotics, and drones, and particularly as it pertains to the CCP. So before the pandemic started and hit the world, he goes on to say he'd published a few books about this and the artificial intelligence dangers to humanity, and so on and so forth. But he then goes on this website, on this article, to bring up how does the CCP threaten the world with AI? Well, through forced tech transfer, espionage, plagiarism, stealing, and of course, collaboration with big tech companies. You know, we're seeing this. Who do you think is behind the Zuckerbergs? Who do you think is behind the founder of Twitter? Who do you think, you know, well, Jack Dorsey on Twitter and things like that? Who do you think is pushing the things that they're doing? All those things with the censorship, all of those things are right in line with the CCP and what the CCP wants, and collaborating with them for getting information. And, you know, most people don't think about it because they just want to go on a site and they want to use it, but, you know, they automatically just accept the terms. Well, if you start reading some of those terms, you'll actually start to find out that you're agreeing to allowing all the information you have to be shared with organizations like the CCP. And people don't get that. They don't realize that. All they say is, oh, it's just the standard mumbo-jumbo legal wording and then blah, 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 blah. But you know, you don't really realize what you're giving up when you agree to be in some of these social media platforms. And it's, you know, it's a real struggle because people say, well, I want to grow my business, I want to do this, I want to do that, but then, you know, or I want to communicate with people, and so they give into it. They give into it and they allow it, and this is how they do it. They data mine, you know, even using a cell phone company, for example, and you agree to the terms of their contracts and their services, which can include allowing your information to go to the CCP, which they can then will use in all different ways against you. And if they actually were able to gain control over things in America, they can come back and say, well, you know, on blah, 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 blah date, you said this thing and that thing, and now we're going to arrest you even though it's 20 years later. These are the types of things that they're working with AI on. But he goes on to say that by bringing the world's data together and bringing it into the 5G, 6G smart city grid, which we know is really not a good thing, but that's what's been getting created. We know there's a lot of hands in that are not really for the welfare of humanity. And what they can do with that, what the CCP can do, is they can mobilize machines and drones and robots and bioengineered and cybernetically enhanced soldiers. They can rule the BRI, which is the Belt Road Initiative, or One Belt, One Road. You heard me mention that earlier. And it's the reemergence of the old Silk Road, which is connected to the Persian Empire and the Chinese Empire and to Europe and parts of Africa, and you know, all these things. It connects. It connects through all of these countries. You know, it not only connects China to the Middle East and to Europe and to Africa, but it's also now will connect them to the New World, which is North America and Antarctica and Afghanistan and Greenland and excavations there. You know, it connects them into getting rare earth minerals for the military industrial complex. You see, it's got massive, massive things as you start to get into this. And it's really, it's interesting and it's scary, and it is amazing the way that they work and that they bring these things together. And so, you know, if you really come to know, and he talks about this, if you come to know how the CCP treats their own people with a lot of cruelty, putting them into labor camps, slave camps, and even killing them for organ harvesting. and such as the Falun Dafa people, the Tibetans, the Christians, the Uyghurs, and even people who don't have a religion, and they come down and they do them. And if a regime puts people in slave camps, engages in organ trafficking, and we have a global pandemic, what could happen if the CCP gets control of that BRI? What could they do when they hook up the AI system to the infrastructure on the 5G, 6G systems to mobilize machines? These are the questions he's asking. They'll not only control people with the normal influence in geopolitics and policy, but they'll have machines and robots and drones to be able to enforce all of their tyranny, all of their control, their practices, and keep humanity in check with what they want. It's a pretty scary world, and this is why we're at this pivotal point. This is why we've got to pay attention. This is why we've got to take a look and really come to understand these things. But what I love about this is it's showing us how all these different pieces are coming together, right? You know, we've talked about 5G being an issue, and we've talked about the vaccines being an issue, and we've talked about the different risings of groups through the BLM movements and the you know, anti-fascist movements and Antifa and things like this, and we're starting to see it all come together right now in our world. We're starting to see how all these pieces interact and how all these different components lead right back to the CCP and these globalist and the communist and the Marxist mindsets, and how their plans are overlapping and how they're coming together and things. So it's really, really interesting, and certainly you can delve, you know, more into that and the risk and his work if you want to. And you know, one of the questions he's got in this article is what is the solution to solve the CCP big tech challenges? And you know, he talks about their global plan is to not only for expansion and wealth, but you know, it's about enslavement. It's really about human enslavement when you come down to it, and not really seeing humans as humans, but more as commodity, as product, as perpetuating these different things that they want to perpetuate in the world. So pretty big stuff for us to stay on top of, and this is why all the roads lead back to CCP, and this is why we have to really pay attention about how we're implementing these things. If we're going to use AI to move forward or to create more technological advances, we also have to understand the risks that come with that. We have to also understand how groups like the CCP have their hands in it and what they're doing and what they're using it for, because it's not all about just bringing healing to people in the world. And we have to deal with this reality. Sure, it's great if all we used it for was good things and positive things and stuff like that, but we have to realize there are people out there who are going to misuse it, and it's going to create some challenges that we probably really don't want to get into, and we have to stay on top of. This is why we have to really pay attention to these ideologies as they're surfacing up and things. Okay, so now let's get on to those Confucius Institute aspects. And the Confucius Institute, you know, again, as we know, they are an influence of the CCP. They come in, they're supposed to appear as this positive influence to expand diversity in our communities. I mean, how many times have you heard that through our current political administration in the U.S. and other ones, this diversity awareness thing? And so they come across as an innocent enough school to teach people about languages and stuff like that. But what we saw back in, this was put out August 14th, 2020, but back at the end of July, July 31st, the Confucius Institute at the University of Arizona closed, and that had been opened in 2008. So when again, when you look back at that, those aspects and who was in office at that time, and definitely CCP influenced people were in office at that time. And then we have the next one here, which is the Tufts, and they ended up closing. This came out just actually recently, March 17th, 2021, that they just recently closed their China-funded Confucius Institute. So again, you see it's China-funded. It's not just China-funded, it's really CCP-funded, even if they don't list them on certain things. It really is. And actually, they've ended up, there's been more than 50 across the United States, I think now, that have been closed or are in the process of closing. So they're pretty much closing this down, as they're saying, pretty much as long as the CCP is funding these institutes, and they're, if they're not going to turn over information as far as who's funding them and things like that, then they're going to have to close because they're violating different things. And this Tufts University renewed its contract with the Institute in 2019 for 2 years, but it's going to let the agreement expire in September. So you've got all of these different components, and this is where they come on and they say, look, look at how we're creating understanding between people. Look at how we're teaching them about different cultures and things like this. And they offer at the Confucius Institute, for example, Mandarin language classes and cultural programming. And some of these things are controversial. When you get into cultural programming, that's a little more of the controversial side of things, because that's where some of the propaganda and the information influences come into play with it. And so they've been involved with a lot of these so-called higher education, universities, colleges, things like that. But what they found in a 2019 U.S. Senate investigation, that the Chinese government provided about $158 million over 13 years to establish and run more than 100 institutes in the U.S. And that wasn't just the university connections, that included our K through 12 schools. So remember, I just, in part 2, talked about the re-education and what was going on in our school system. Well, here this sheds another piece of light on it, right? $158 million over 13 years they put into the schools. And as we know, this is how they infiltrate in. This is one of the ways they do it. They fund things. They put things in. They become financiers. They're financial partners in things. And then they have control, and then they can control what is being taught, what textbooks are being used. They can control the information. They can put forth their propaganda in these aspects. And so, this has become a big thing. The Tufts University really came out with these various aspects of this, because they're connected to several of them. And their overdue decision to disband, it says here in this article, its Confucius Institute is the right one, and I hope it represents a sign that the academia is finally waking up to the threat of the Chinese Communist Party poses to colleges and our country. And that was said by gentleman Seth Moulton. And that's even a Democrat. That's even a Democrat that said that. You wouldn't necessarily expect that these days, but it was. And so, even these parties are starting to recognize that, hey, this is really a big issue. And even when you go on, I went on to the Confucius Institute website here, and right on the front page, and again, you can look through things, and it doesn't seem like much on the outside, but the Confucius U.S. Institute is a not-for-profit educational institution in Washington, D.C., whose mission is to advance global education, right there, global education, and cross-cultural understanding through educational and professional development, arts, culture, academics, and research and public outreach. So this is the current, so this is where they use these words. Remember how too many times I say, anytime I see global now, it's like a big red flag. It's a big red flag, cross-cultural understanding. They use these terminology, and it really, oh my goodness, this is how they kind of get into people, because people think, oh, this is like a world thing, like everybody's coming together, and it's not. It's really about this global financial institution. It's really about this centralized control aspect that's going on. And here again, this is one of the ways that they this doesn't mean understanding more about the world or being more understanding of people in different parts of the world. This global education is really about educating people all around the world to what the CCP wants you to know and think, and to their policies and their ways of doing things, and how they want you to think about things in the world. So it's not really as innocent as you would like to think it is. And when we come over into here, where was it? It was one of these that I was into. Our team, our board of directors, was it? And I always come on, this is a really good thing, because so many things look good on the surface, but I found if you start going into who's involved in it and get into like the members, and you get into like the board of directors and start looking at what they're involved in and who they're connected to, that oftentimes can unfold where some of these connections are. And one of the ones that caught my eye was this Lixia Chen, who's an associate professor there, and she was invited to work with the APEC education. And APEC, when you start to research into them, they have all kinds of corrupt ties and chains, and they kind of really come right into the CCP connection. So that was one of the things that they stood out, because APEC they've had some not so good stuff attached to them. We'll kind of leave it we'll kind of leave it at that, let's say. So, they list these credentials, and it always sounds so good on the surface, right? It always sounds so good. But when you get in and you start reading some of these things, and you start reading who they're connected to and what else they're involved in and where they put their time with things, that can really tell you a whole lot of, what is behind the scenes and what is there. So definitely a big thing to always come in and take a look at. Now, the letter that stemmed everything for this Confucius Institute centers and getting them to close down is this letter that was put out on August 13th, 2020, and it was put out from our United States Department of State. And it came right into the director of the Institute's King Ching, forgive me, I don't know the pronunciation on that exactly, but it reads as this. This is to notify you formally that pursuant to the enclosed determination number 2020-5, dated August 12, 2020, the Confucius Institute U.S. Center has been designated as a foreign mission for purposes of the Foreign Missions Act, Title 22 U.S.C. 4301 at Squire. Well, CIUS is not involved in diplomatic or consular activities, and its employees are not considered government officials or representatives. The Department of State has concluded that CIUS is effectively controlled by the government of the People's Republic of China and is therefore subject to treatment as a foreign mission under Section 4302A3 of the Act. Consistent with this designation, the Department's Office of Foreign Missions has further determined that CIUS shall henceforth be subject to certain terms and conditions as set forth in this letter, pursuant to 22 U.S.C. 4304B. Such actions have been determined to be reasonably necessary to protect the interest of the United States and to adjust for the cost and procedures of obtaining benefits by the United States mission to the People's Republic of China. Effective immediately, CIUS must notify the Department of its personnel via OFM's eGov system. In order to do so, CIUS is required to designate a point of contact via email to the email address there no later than August 20th, 2020. OFM will coordinate with the point of contact to effectuate access to the OFM's eGov system. Effective immediately, CIUS must also notify the Department of all real property and interest currently held in the United States and its territories by CIUS or by the People's Republic of China or any subdivision thereof. So really what they're calling for here in this, and I won't go through all of it, but what they're really calling for is to say, look, we know that you may own more than just these institutes, or that the People's Republic of China has got their hands in things, and you have to disclose any property interest, anything that you're connected to that has the connections to the People's Republic of China. So, they're saying that because they are, basically owned by the People's Republic of China, that they're a security risk right now in the U.S., and that came out last year in things. Now, I don't know, Biden may have eased up on some of this, but I can certainly put links to these things in the description section for you, and then you'll be able to access and read the full documentation yourself. Now, that being said, I next want to delve into some aspects where we're going to listen to some different parts of clips of things here. And I want to get into this set of clips, by the way. I kind of want to warn people, if you are sensitive to things, sensitive to seeing things like that could potentially connect to violence, or I know that some people are very sensitive and they're hard, it's hard for them to see certain things. You may want to watch with caution, or you may want to be where you can turn away quickly and not see something in there, or however that works for you. But I do want to delve into this, and I came across this series. It's by NTD, and they are a news channel that covers different things that are happening around the world. They cover a lot of things that are happening here in the U.S., and they're kind of politically based in the sense that they cover what is, well, they're not really, yes and no, they're politically based. I mean, they share what's happening on the political front, but as well as other stories and things too. So they're kind of like a regular type of news channel in many ways, and they're very kind of factually based. And they put out this series actually that is how the specter of communism is ruling our world. Basically, it's a whole, I think it's a 10-part series, if I'm correct on this one, that talks about how they're coming in, how they're ruling the world. It talks about the history of leading up to things, of how they got into it. And I find that some of these clips are really going to be very similar. And actually, before I get into that, let me jump and bring up one more thing. One more clip here. Oh, hold on just a minute.
Right now, the Chinese Communist Party is spreading propaganda and...
Let me jump into this. Let me just get this over on my other screen, and I apologize. I should have copied and pasted this in sooner so that it would have been easier. Okay. And we're going to jump forward on this a little bit. This video put together by End Times Productions, and it has to do with some aspects of Malcolm X factors, and this gentleman, it was Malcolm X and Yuri Bezmenov, who actually lays out the key components, the 4 stages that happen in this process that the CCP and the communist regimes work with. So take a listen to this.
Brainwashing process, which goes very slow and is divided in 4 basic stages. The first one being demoralization. It takes from 15 to 20 years to demoralize a nation. Why that many years? Because this is the minimum number of years which requires to educate 1 generation of students in the country of your enemy, exposed to the ideology of the enemy. In other words, Marxism-Leninism ideology is being pumped into the soft heads of at least 3 generations of American students without being challenged or counterbalanced by the basic values of Americanism, American patriotism. The demoralization process in the United States is basically completed already. For the last 25 years, actually it's overfulfilled, because demoralization now reaches such areas where previously not even Comrade Andropov and all his experts would even dream of such a tremendous success. Most of it is done by Americans to Americans, thanks to lack of moral standards. As I mentioned before, exposure to true information does not matter anymore. A person who was demoralized is unable to assess true information. The facts tell nothing to him. Even if I shower him with information, with authentic proof, with documents, with pictures, even if I take him by force to the Soviet Union and show him concentration camp, he will refuse to believe it until he is going to receive a kick in his fat bottom. When a military boot crashes his balls, then he will understand, but not before that. That's the tragic of the situation of demoralization. The next stage is destabilization. This time, subverter does not care about your ideas and the patterns of your consumption. Whether you eat junk food and get fat and flabby, doesn't matter anymore. This time, and it takes only from 2 to 5 years to destabilize a nation, what matters is essentials: economy, foreign relations, defense systems. And you can see it quite clearly that in some areas, in such sensitive areas as defense and economy, the influence of Marxist-Leninist ideas in the United States is absolutely fantastic. I could never believe it 14 years ago when I landed in this part of the world, that the process will go that fast. The next stage, of course, is crisis. It may take only up to 6 weeks to bring a country to the verge of crisis. You can see it in Central America now. And after crisis, with a violent change of power, structure, and economy, you have so-called the period of normalization. It may last indefinitely. Normalization is a cynical expression borrowed from Soviet propaganda. When the Soviet tanks moved into Czechoslovakia in '68, Comrade Brezhnev said, "Now the situation in brotherly Czechoslovakia is normalized." This is what will happen in the United States if you allow all the schmucks to bring the country to crisis, to promise people all kind of goodies and the paradise on earth, to destabilize your economy, to eliminate the principle of free market competition, and to put a big brother government in Washington, D.C., with benevolent dictators like Walter Mondale, who will promise lots of things, never mind whether the promises are fulfillable or not. You're leftists. in the United States, all these professors and all these beautiful civil rights defenders, they are instrumental in the process of the subversion only to destabilize the nation. When their job is completed, they are not needed anymore. They know too much. Some of them, when they get disillusioned, when they see that Marxist-Leninists come to power, obviously they get offended. They think that they will come to power. That will never happen, of course. They will be lined up against the wall and shot. But they may turn into the most bitter enemies of Marxist-Leninists when they come to power. And that's what happened in Nicaragua. You remember most of these former Marxist-Leninists were either put to prison or one of them split, and now he's working against Sandinistas. It happened in Grenada when Maurice Bishop was already a Marxist. He was executed by a new Marxist who was more Marxist than this Marxist. Same happened in Afghanistan when first there was Taraki, he was killed by Amin, then Amin was killed by Babrak Karmal with the help of KGB. Same happened in Bangladesh when Mujibur Rahman, very pro-Soviet leftist, was assassinated by his own Marxist-Leninist military comrades. It's the same pattern everywhere. The time bomb is ticking. With every second, the disaster is coming closer and closer. Unlike myself, you will have nowhere to defect.
What did you think about?
You can see on there, he talked about that normalization, and when you look at that in regards to our crisis and how they have to have a crisis to bring about this normalization, and that it never goes back to normal, is what he's saying here. It never does reach back to that point. It's all about crashing the system. It's all about destabilizing it. And you noticed where he talked about putting certain people into place, which is exactly what we just saw in this last election here in the United States, of putting those puppets into place and things. So, yeah, I really wanted to bring that up because those 4 stages really outline the keys to how they work and how they move through things. And of course, what he talked about, demoralization takes a long period of time. The destabilization is only a few years. And then you culminate that in a crisis. Oh, I don't know, say like a pandemic or something like that. Shutdowns, things like that. And then you promise this normalization. You promise this beautiful world. What did we have? We had one administration who is now in office who made all these promises to people, all of these promises to people that they were going to have this beautiful new world now. If they voted for them, they were going to get this, they were going to get that, and they're not getting any of it because they don't care about following through on their promises. They don't care about following through on things. So let's move on to this part 1, and I have actually pieces from 4 parts of this series that I want to share with you and kind of go through with you a little bit as they talk about it, and we'll do a few minutes on each one here. But, you know, for those that really want to understand more about this, this series is really a great factually kind of based series to show things, and you'll see how things have these repeating patterns, how things are repeating about every 100 years, and how much we're repeating things that happened in World War I and World War II, and how these things just cycle and cycle and cycle through that. So let's go ahead and take a listen here. This comes from part 1 of this special series about the Chinese Communist Party.
In the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe marked the end of a half-century-long Cold War between the capitalist and communist camps in the East and West. Many were thus optimistic, holding the belief that communism had become a relic of the past. The sad truth, however, is that a stealthily transformed communist ideology has instead taken hold and entrenched itself around the world. There are the outright communist regimes like China, North Korea, Cuba, and Vietnam. There are the former Soviet Union and Eastern European countries, where communist ideology and customs still exert a significant influence. There are the African and South American countries, which attempt socialism under the banner of democracy and republicanism, And then there are the nations of Europe and North America, whose body politics have become hosts to communist influences without people even realizing it. Communism breeds war, famine, slaughter, and tyranny. These in themselves are terrible.
Did you catch that part, what he said, what they actually breed in there? Let me see if I can pop back just a second here. How they breed war, famine, tyranny, that's where it leads to. So these people who are promising you things in the government are really leading you to war, famine, and tyranny. And what is happening? They're trying to shut down our food chains right now. Biden has already started wars. And we're seeing this tyranny rule where they're just not even going through the legal system, where they're just trying to demolish, basically, the Constitution that we have. Let's keep listening.
But the damage dealt by communism goes far beyond this. It has become increasingly clear to many that, unlike any other system in history, what communism declares war on is humanity itself, including human values and human dignity. Over the course of a century, communism established massive dictatorships in the Soviet Union and China. It caused more than 100 million unnatural deaths. It enslaved billions, and it brought the world to the brink of nuclear war and thus destruction. Yet more important is its deliberate and widespread destruction of the family, its instigation of social disorder, and its attack on morality, all of which are ruinous to the foundations of civilization. What, then, is the nature of communism? What is its objective? Why does it take mankind as its enemy? How can we escape it? 1. Communism is a devil bent on the destruction of humanity. The Communist Manifesto begins, quote, "A specter is haunting Europe, the specter of communism." The use of the term specter was not a whim of Karl Marx. The preface of this book argues that communism should not be understood as being an ideological movement, a political doctrine, or a failed attempt at a new way of ordering human affairs. Instead, it should be understood as being a devil, an evil specter forged by hate, degeneracy, and other elemental forces in the universe. The communist specter took the form of a serpent, then that of a red dragon, and it keeps company with Satan, who hates God, and exploits low-level beings and demons to wreak havoc on man. The goal of the specter is to ruin humanity, and while the divine offers salvation to humanity, communism tells man not to believe, attacks human morality so as to renounce tradition, and causes man not to heed God's instruction, and ultimately to be destroyed. Following the Cold War, the poison of communism not only continued to harm former communist countries, but also spread throughout the world. The ideological infiltration of communism has led the specter to influence human society on a global scale, and many people even think that the dark wishes of communism are their own. With this, people lose their ability to judge right from wrong, to differentiate good from evil. This, a devil's conspiracy, was almost carried out. Thus, even as the specter congratulated itself, delighted with its sinister victory, most people thought that it had been destroyed. There's nothing more dangerous than mankind being on the verge of destruction, yet ignorantly celebrating its triumph.
It's amazing how it's coming in, and I love how this series really kind of brings together these pieces to show how we're allowing it in and how they actually use coercion to the point where you start believing these are your own thoughts, how they operate to separate us from our divine nature, from the divinity, from our God connection, and to bring us into our own destruction. Because in certain ways, when you get into the whole spiritual realm, there's an aspect of, well, you self-destructed yourself. You chose to do this. You chose to go down this path. And it's a pretty crazy, way that we start getting into everything. So the next clip that I want to show you out of this series comes from part 6 in the series here. And let's go ahead and look at this. And again, because they have so many great ways of bringing this together and sharing the pieces and the information that are here. And again, you know, this series, again, those that are sensitive, you may not always want to look at the screens on these because, you know, they do show different things. Sometimes there can be some unpleasant scenes or violent scenes involved in them.
Four, the end of the Cold War. The end of the Cold War was a great relief for many. They thought that socialism, communism, and similar tyrannies had finally come to an end. But this was simply another way for communism to win. The standoff between the United States and the Soviet Union diverted people's attention away from the Chinese Communist Party and gave it time to carry out more malicious and sneaky schemes. The Tiananmen Massacre on June 4, 1989, marked the rise of party leader Jiang Zemin, aided by the party's suppression and propaganda machine that had already matured. Jiang continued to systematically destroy traditional culture and manufacture party culture. By destroying morals, Jiang cultivated a society of wolf cubs, youth who were anti-tradition and anti-morality, which made way for the large-scale persecution of Falun Gong, and eventually destruction of humankind.
For those that aren't familiar with the Falun Gong, that was a belief system that really focused on compassion and unity and living in the divine self.
Although communists have fallen from power in the former communist countries, communism has never been tried for the crimes it committed on a global level. Russia, similarly, has never purged the Soviet influence or abolished the secret police apparatus. The former head of the KGB is now in charge of the country. Communist ideologies and their followers not only still exist, but are spreading their influence to the West and around the world. The anti-communist activists in the West, the older generations who have a deeper understanding of communism, are gradually dying out.
I want you to think about that for a moment. When we look at this in light of the pandemic, and we saw the attacks on nursing homes, we saw the attacks on elderly people, we saw this happening particularly like in New York. We saw it happening in Pennsylvania and a couple of other states where they sent the infected people into the nursing homes. And why attack the elderly? You know, I think that was one of the questions for a lot of people. Well, this is exactly why. When you're dealing with the CCP agenda, when you're dealing with their format of implementing things, you would get rid of those people because they are the generation that remembers. They are the generation that can still speak up and say, look, I lived through this before at this earlier time. I'm familiar with this from Depression times, from war times and things like this. And this is repeating itself. This is communism. They're the ones that are aware and that they know. So if you alleviate that aging population, if you alleviate that elderly population, they can't tell anybody. They can't raise the awareness. They can't wake up the younger kids. And, you know, this is really a challenging piece because so many of the ones that are dying were grandparents, and the grandparents, they were such great influences on the younger generation, and they are the ones that our kids would still listen to, and now we're seeing so much of the young generation get sucked up into supporting these CCP linguistics and the socialism and the, you know, type of linguistics and method aspects of doing things. Because they think it's something good.
While members of the newer generations lack a sufficient understanding of, and the will to understand, communism's evil, murderous, and deceptive nature. Consequently, communists have been able to continue their radical or progressive movements to destroy the existing ideologies and social structures and even seize power through violence. A. Red Square is still red. As other former communist countries called for independence in succession, people in the Soviet Union also yearned for change. Politics fell into chaos, the economy collapsed, and Russia was isolated in foreign affairs. Then Russian President Boris Yeltsin declared that the Soviet Communist Party was illegal and restricted its activities. People were energetic in expressing their long-held contempt for the party, and on December 26, 1991, the Supreme Soviet passed a law to dissolve the Soviet Union, marking the end of its 69-year rule. But how could deeply rooted communist ideologies yield so easily? Yeltsin set off a decommunization campaign upon establishing the Russian Federation. Statues of Lenin were pulled down, Soviet books were burned, former Soviet government employees were laid off, and many Soviet-related objects were smashed or burned. But all this still didn't get to the essence of communism. The denazification movement after World War II was much more thorough, from the public trials of Nazi war criminals to the cleansing of fascist ideology. The very word Nazi is now tied to a sense of shame. Even today, the hunt for former Nazis continues in order to bring them to justice. Unfortunately for Russia, where communist forces were still strong, the absence of a thorough purge of communism left room for them to make a comeback. In October 1993, only 2 years after the citizens of Moscow had taken to the streets to demand their independence and democracy, tens of thousands of Moscow citizens marched on the city square, shouting the names of Lenin and Stalin and waving the former Soviet flags. The rally in 1993 was of communists asking for the reinstatement of the Soviet system. The presence of troops and police only intensified the confrontation. At the critical moment, the security services and military officials chose to support Yeltsin, who then dispatched military tanks to quiet down the crisis. Yet communist forces still remained and established the Russian Communist Party, which became the largest political party in the country until it was replaced by the current ruling party, Vladimir Putin's United Russia. In recent years, in some surveys, such as those conducted by Moscow's RBK-TV from 2015 to 2016, many respondents, about 60%, have said that the Soviet Union should be reborn. In May 2017, many Russians commemorated the 100th anniversary of the Soviet Union's rise to power. The Soviet Communist Youth League, Komsomol, which was established during the Soviet Union, held an oath-swearing ceremony for youths joining them in Moscow's Red Square before Lenin's tomb. At the rally, the chairman of Russia's Communist Party, Gennady Zyuganov, claimed the 60,000 new recruits had joined the party recently and that the Communist Party continued to survive and expand. In Moscow,
remember, we found out earlier that the communist, not so much the Russia one, but the CCP had grown to 90 million, and then there was another 80 million in the youth organizations. And so you see what happens is they alleviate the older people who have been through things before, and then they come in and the younger kids don't know, and they're just swept. They're swept right into these situations and brought into these youth groups.
Alone, there are almost 80 monuments to Lenin, whose body, entombed in Red Square, continues to attract tourists and followers. Red Square is still red. The KGB has never been thoroughly exposed and condemned by the world. Communism is still present in Russia, and believers of communism still abound. B. The Red Calamity continues. There are currently 4 countries ruled by self-declared communist regimes: China, Vietnam, Cuba, and Laos. Although North Korea has abandoned Marxist-Leninist communism on the surface, in actuality, it is still a communist totalitarian state. Before the Cold War, there were 27 communist countries. Now, there are 13 countries where communist parties are allowed to participate in politics, while there are currently about 120 countries that have registered communist parties. But over the past century, communist influence in government has faded away in most countries. However, the majority of these countries still came under variants of socialism, rather than calling themselves communist.
You see what they're doing? They're coming in as socialism, and in a lot of areas, they're coming into those that are equivalent to like the Democratic parties in the U.S., other countries have those aspects too of Democratic parties, and that's exactly what they are focusing on, not just Democrats, but specifically a Democratic Socialist Party, and that's what we've seen here in the U.S.
Political parties took on names like the Democratic Socialist Party, the People's Socialist Party, and the like. Of the 33 independent countries in Latin America and the Caribbean, the majority have communist parties that are accepted as legitimate political players. In Venezuela, Chile, Uruguay, and elsewhere, the Communist Party and the ruling party often form coalition governments, while communist parties in other countries play the role of opposition. In the West, and in some countries in other regions, communism did not resort to violent methods as was done in the East. But through subversion, it has subtly infiltrated society and achieved its goals of destroying people's moral values, destroying the culture God has imparted to them, and spreading communist and socialist ideologies.
And that's exactly what we've seen here in the United States, where they have infiltrated in through these socialist movements. And this is where we've seen the protests, particularly over the last year, but through many points in time, aspects where they've done this infiltration into these groups, and they use socialism because it always sounds so good. Think of all the youth that have drawn to Bernie Sanders and some of these other leaders who are socialist, and they think it sounds good because they think everybody's going to be equal. They think everybody should be taken care of, and the kids are swept up in this, not realizing how it's moving everything into a centralized, tyrannical, totalitarian rule.
The Spectre has, in fact, gained control over the entire world. Achieving the ultimate goal of destroying humankind is only a step away.
And this brings up that aspect of we are always on this edge. We are always so close to extinction in many ways. And if we don't stay on top of these aspects of infiltration, we are going to be overtaken. And their whole aspect is about the extinction of humanity, not just the extinction, but the total removal of humanitarians, of humanity in general. And this is why they're working with AI, and this is where you start to see the connections and the pieces come in from Gates, and working with people like Gates and people like Fauci to push forward things, the UN, why they're so heavily involved in the UN and influencing them in aspects, because when you draw those people in, these are the people that can then use the whole combination of things, right? The drugs, the crisis, the AI, the technology, and they bring it all together to start to do genocide. And then it's supported by a legal body, or not even legal body, but a group or a governing body of some sort like the UN. And people have been taught to believe that, which has been propaganda and this coercion that has been pushed into that to literally brainwash people to trust these organizations that are really not doing them any good. So as we move on, we have this next part, which comes out of part 8 in the series, of this series, and moving forward. So let me share with you what you have here. As you can see, this is really interesting information, how it comes together, and we start to see some of these things where these are the same things that are playing out in our world now. Some of the things that happened 100 years ago, that happened in the early part of the 1900s, are happening today.
Three, from the New Deal to progressivism.
And I want you to think about this with the New Deal, because the New Deal is something that's come up a few times in time, and they're going to talk about it a little bit here, but this is where also policies like they're trying to implement right now here in the States and other places around the world where you hear about the new Green Deal. Well, that is just another version, another step, another piece of this New Deal aspect that they've been using for quite some time, really.
On Thursday, October 24, 1929, the New York stock market crashed. The crisis spread from the financial sector to the entire economy, sparing none of the major developed nations of the West. Unemployment spiked to over a quarter of the population, and the total number of unemployed exceeded 30 million. Apart from the Soviet Union, industrial production in major industrial countries dropped by an average of 27%. In early 1933, within 100 days of Roosevelt's inauguration, many bills were introduced around the theme of solving the crisis.
Think about this. We're seeing this, too, in our own administration right now. Oh, look, we're going to introduce these bills to solve the crisis, to alleviate the pandemic. And that's not really what these bills are about. When you get in and read them, as I've encouraged people to do, and there's the government sites that you can go in and read them on, they're not about solving the crisis. They have all these other little caveats worked into them.
The policies increased government intervention in the economy and passed major reforms. Congress enacted the Emergency Banking Act, Agricultural Adjustment Act, National Industrial Recovery Act, and Social Security Act. Though Roosevelt's New Deal essentially ended by the outbreak of World War II, many of the institutions and organizations that emerged during the period have continued to shape American society to the present day. Roosevelt issued more executive orders than the total number of such decrees previously issued by all presidents in the 20th century.
So think about that. A lot of things that Biden is doing now is almost a repeat of what Roosevelt was doing, right? Biden has signed massive amounts of executive orders coming into office right off the bat, more so than several other presidents put together. And that's exactly what happened in this time. We're seeing a repeat of history of when Roosevelt was in office.
Nevertheless, the American unemployment rate in the United States did not fall below double digits until the war. The New Deal's real effect was to set the U.S. government on a trajectory of high taxation, big government.
You see that? High taxation, big government. And that's exactly what I talked about in part 2 of how they're planning to pay for a lot of these things, how they're planning to pay for the immigration, how they're planning on paying for these so-called educational programs and the new Green Deal and these things. It's all about raising the taxes humongously. And that's where I brought it up in part 2 of how we could actually see our taxes go into 70 to 95%. And that means you're taking home almost nothing. You're almost working for nothing at that point.
Economic interventionism. In his 2017 book, The Big Lie, Exposing the Nazi Roots of the American Left, conservative thinker Dinesh D'Souza argued that the National Recovery Act, which formed the centerpiece of Roosevelt's New Deal, essentially meant the end of the U.S. free market. According to FDR's Folly, a 2003 book by historian Jim Powell, the New Deal prolonged the Great Depression rather than ending it. The Social Security Act and labor laws encouraged further unemployment, while high taxes encumbered healthy business and like.
Exactly what we're seeing now. Again, it is bringing in that taxation. It's driving people towards unemployment. It is crashing the economy in some ways. It's got all these pieces just exactly following suit here.
Economist and Nobel Prize laureate Milton Friedman praised Powell's work, saying, quote, "As Powell demonstrates without a shadow of a doubt, the New Deal hampered recovery from the contraction, prolonged and added to unemployment, and set the stage for ever more intrusive and costly."
And this is exactly what they want to see. They're trying to drive people into unemployment. They're trying to get rid of that middle class factor right now. They are trying to keep them on the system. Because when people are on the system, they can control them. They can tell them what they can eat. They can tell them whether they have to be vaccinated. They can govern everything with them, and they can drive them to follow these socialist formats, to drive them to follow the CCP formats, because they have them trapped and controlled on these systems. So they try to make it very encouraging and try to keep them on the systems in so many ways.
Government. President Lyndon Johnson, who took office after the assassination of President Kennedy in 1963, declared a war on poverty in his 1964 State of the Union address. And
now think about this, because this is one of the things that the Kamala Harris-Biden campaigned on, is campaigning against a war on poverty, or declaring a war on poverty. It's very interesting to see that some of the terms that they used when they went through their term is exactly what was used in these previous administrations.
And launched the Great Society domestic programs. In a short period of time, Johnson issued a series of executive orders, established new government agencies, reinforced the welfare state, raised taxes, and dramatically expanded the government's authority.
And we see that now, right? Because they've been stacking the courts. They're trying to push the filibuster through right now, and they're trying to stack all of the government's authority into this socialist CCP concept and construct.
It is interesting to note the similarities between President Johnson's administrative measures and a new program of the American Communist Party's New Agenda, published in 1966. Gus Hall, General Secretary of the CPUSA, said, quote, "The communist attitude toward the Great Society can be summarized in an old saying that two men sleeping in the same bed can have different dreams. We communists support every measure of the Great Society concept because we dream of socialism." Hall's, quote, "same bed" refers to the Great Society policies. Although the CPUSA also supported the Great Society initiative, the intention of the Johnson administration was to improve the United States under the democratic system. The Communist Party's intention was to ease the United States into socialism step by step. The most serious consequences of the Great Society and the war on poverty are threefold. They increased dependence on welfare, discouraged people from working, and damaged the family structure. Welfare policies favored single-parent families, in turn encouraging divorce and children born out of wedlock. According to statistics, the rate of children born out of wedlock in 1940 was 3.8% among all newborns. By 1965, this figure had increased to 7.7%. In 1990, 25 years after the Great Society reform, the figure was 28% and again rose to 40% in 2012. The disintegration of the family brought with it a series of widespread consequences, such as an increased financial burden for the government, a soaring crime rate, the decline of family education, families that are stuck in poverty for generations, and a mentality of entitlement, which led to a higher rate of voluntary unemployment.
So you see, really, this war on poverty, it really doesn't help poverty. It doesn't really help the people who really need it. It actually ends up locking them into poverty for many generations. It actually locks them into these pieces. So when you start to think back on it and you think, wow, it's amazing, this infiltration, how it has come through over generation, over decades. It's been a very slow process of working through this phase to destroy the family, to tear them apart, and how these policies are taken and implemented into these political agendas to drive people in certain directions, to drive them into these system dependencies. And they like to do it now, like under the guise of, look, everybody's going to have the same health care. Oh, look, everybody's going to be able to have a wage and not do it. But they're not telling you, again, all of the pieces that go along with that.
A quote attributed to Scottish historian and jurist Lord Alexander Fraser Tytler says, quote, "A democracy cannot exist as a permanent form of government. It can only exist until the voters discover that they can vote themselves largesse from the public treasury. From that time on, the majority always votes for the candidate promising the most benefits from the public treasury, with the result that a democracy always collapses over loose fiscal policy, always followed by a dictatorship." As the Chinese...
So you see how that's happening now in our society? Like we have that in the U.S. with our administration. They're very loose fiscal policies, and it is going straight into a dictatorship.
Chinese saying goes, quote, "From thrift to extravagance is easy, but the opposite is difficult. After people develop a dependence on welfare, it becomes impossible for the government to reduce the scale and types of benefits. The Western welfare state has become a political quagmire for which politicians and officials have no solution." In the 1970s, the extreme left gave up the revolutionary terms that kept the American people on guard and replaced them with the more neutral-sounding liberalism and progressivism. Readers who lived in communist countries are no stranger to the latter, as progress has been used by the Communist Party as a quasi-synonym for communism. For example, the term progressive movement referred to the communist movement, and progressive intellectuals referred to pro-communist individuals or underground members of the Communist Party. Liberalism, meanwhile, is not substantially different from progressivism, as it carries the same connotation of high taxes, expansive welfare, big government, rejection of religion, morality, and tradition, the use of social justice as a political weapon, political correctness, and the militant promotion of feminism, homosexuality, sexual perversity, and the like. We do not intend to point fingers at any political figure or individual, for it is indeed difficult to make correct analysis and judgments in the midst of complex historical developments. It is clear that the specter of communism has been at work in both the East and West since the beginning of the 20th century. When violent revolution succeeded in the East, it spread the influence of communism to the governments and societies of the West.
So you can really see where these terms that we're seeing come up and how they shift the terms and how they use them are really actually communist terms that are being used. Now, as we move on to the final part of this series, it's a part of episode 10 that I want to bring through here for you. It's just really interesting when you hear these things being said and how they were used in previous times and how they're coming back around. And I think if we're aware of this, then we can really start to understand how to mitigate some of this and how to bring some of this into check and to pay attention to where these terms are being used so that we understand what they're actually promoting and supporting.
Eight, political correctness, the devil's thought police. Communist countries practice strict control over speech and thought. However, since the 1980s, another form of speech and thought control has appeared in the West. Thought police use the banner of, quote, political correctness to run amok in the media, society, and education system, using slogans and mass criticism to restrain speech and thought. Even though many have already felt the evil power of this control, they have not grasped its ideological origins. Phrases such as political correctness, together with progress, and solidarity have long been used by communist parties. Their superficial meaning is to avoid using language that is discriminatory towards minorities, women, the disabled, and others. For example, black people are to be called African Americans. American Indians are to be called Native Americans. Illegal immigrants are to be called undocumented workers, and so on.
And think about this. Remember in my first part on this series, I talked about this, of how they don't want to call them illegal aliens anymore. They want to call them undocumented workers. You see, and we have tons of things that passed as Biden came into office that all of a sudden they changed all the linguistics on things. You can't say man or woman anymore. You can't use those kind of sexual references that identify one sex or another anymore. Everything has to be gender neutral now. And this is exactly one of these CCP practices where you come in and you change the terminology and you make it sound like you're doing something to be less discriminatory, you know, just like saying you got to be less white, right? And in reality, you are creating this division. In reality, you are supporting these other things.
However, the hidden implication behind political correctness is to classify individuals into groups according to their victim status. Those who are the most oppressed should, therefore, be accorded the most respect and courtesy. This judgment, rendered solely on one's identity and disregarding individual conduct and talent, is the basis of what's called identity politics. Style of thinking is extremely popular in the United States and other Western countries. According to such logic, black lesbians, who are oppressed along vectors of race, sex, and sexual preference, are ranked at the forefront of victimhood. At the other extreme, white heterosexual males are considered the most privileged and, in the logic of victim politics, should be at the bottom of the totem pole. This type of classification is identical to what goes on in communist countries, where individuals were classified within the, quote, 5 classes of red or the, quote, 5 classes of black, according to their wealth and class status before the revolution. The Chinese Communist Party eliminated and oppressed landowners and capitalists because of their, quote, wrong class status, attacked intellectuals as the, quote, stinking old ninth, and chanted that, quote, the poor are the smartest, the nobles the dumbest. For complex historical reasons, including social and individual reasons, some groups have a lower political and socio-economic position, which cannot be simply explained as oppression. But political correctness draws an artificial boundary in people's minds. It sets up an extreme, you're either with us or against us code of morality.
And think about that. This was actually something that Kamala came out and said during the campaigning aspect. You're either with us or you're against us. She used that exact phrase when she was doing the campaigning trail and giving some of her talks and her speeches. And you can see how these things, they have always been rooted back into these CCP roots, and this political correctness, these aspects of these things, how they are used exactly. We've seen them come up very much lately. They're very present and very much in our faces, and this is exactly what they said. You put the black female on a pedestal because she's a victim, and you demoralize the white male. And so we're seeing this play out in this aspect. And again, it's not based on character, it's not based on integrity or ethics, it's just strictly based on a racial identification that that person may or may not actually be a victim. They may not, you know, and here again, it's not necessarily about the race, but this is all about separating people. This is all about creating division and racism.
Where subscribing to political correctness is considered to be moral, while those who dissent are accused of being racist, sexist, homophobic, anti-Islam, and so on.
And so you see, Trump got accused of this by Biden all along in the campaigning trail. Last year, when the crisis came out for COVID, all of these things, and it was because he was speaking up against it. He was speaking up against the communist political warfare aspects that were going on here, this language that was going on. And what did he get accused of? Being homophobic. You see how these exact terms are there? And so this is how we can start to also identify who is working for the people and who is not working for the people along the way, is because when you start to understand how these terms are used and where they came from, then you also start to understand these bigger aspects of what side somebody's standing on and who they're really supporting regardless of what they say.
Universities, which should promote a culture of free expression, have become prisons for the mind. The world is silenced and unable to openly and sincerely grapple with a number of issues in politics, economics, and culture. In the name of political correctness, some organizations work to further push traditional religion out of the public sphere. Furthermore, some countries have expanded the definition of, quote, hate speech and implemented this expanded definition in law, thus using the law to force schools, media, and internet companies to conform. This is a step toward the same.
And this is exactly what I talked about in part 2 of how they use these things to come in and start to control the narrative in the school, how they control what will be taught in the schools, and how they bring these aspects of saying it's okay to talk about transgenderism to first graders.
Restrictors on speech, as found in communist states. After the 2016 U.S. presidential election, the United States became further divided. Protest marches erupted in major cities, and violations of freedom of speech occurred with greater frequency. In September 2017, an appearance by conservative author Ben Shapiro, who had been invited to speak at the University of California, Berkeley, was derailed due to Antifa's threats of violence. Berkeley police stood ready and dispatched 3 police helicopters. The security measures were estimated to have cost more than $600,000. A reporter asked a young student protester, "What about the First Amendment?" To which the student replied that it was no longer a relevant document. Ironically, one signature event that marked the start of the student movement in 1964 was a fight for freedom of speech at Berkeley. These days, the left uses the right to speech in its attempts to deprive others of having a legitimate outlet for their own voice. In March 2017, American social scientist Charles Murray was invited to speak at Middlebury College in Vermont. While there, he was physically assaulted, and an accompanying professor at the college was injured. In March 2018, tenured professor Amy Wax of the University of Pennsylvania School of Law was relieved of some teaching duties after publishing a politically incorrect article. Other organizations acting under the banner of opposing hate speech have labeled regular conservative groups as hate groups. In addition, there have been cases of conservative authors and scholars being threatened about speaking at or attending various events. The intrusion on freedom of speech by the left is not part of normal debate between people with differing ideas. Instead, it's about the specter of communism, using people with ill intent, provoking them to obscure the truth and suppress righteous, or at least normal, voices. Political correctness, in essence, is about substituting deviant political and moral standards for righteous ones. It is.
So you can see this political correctness. This has come out massively in the United States, and it has come out to be used to fuel these racial wars, to fuel the division, and this is exactly what they do. They bring this thought form in, and then they use it for all of these agendas to divide and to separate. And again, sadly, a lot of these kids, they have no idea what they're really supporting, or they've been brought down, as the one kid said in Berkeley, that the Constitution doesn't matter, it doesn't exist anymore. And this is socialism that has brainwashed people out of their own freedom, is what we're talking about. So as we kind of finish up that series of things, let's just take a look here at a couple of pieces that tie into this and some of the shorter little snippets of the things of how they come in, and we have to be careful of them. You know, we've had some great background on how this infiltration happens. And of course, one of the big things that's on the table is the Green New Deal, and that's coming out. And this great article put out by the Federalist actually brought this out, and they outlined the 10 key steps in what the Green New Deal is all about. And one of the key things is that it bans affordable energy. And why is this? Because affordable energy brings freedom. It creates jobs. It feeds the middle class. It's not just about oil and natural gas. It's, not just about the resource itself. But if people have something that's cost affordable, it's harder to tax them. It's harder to take their money from them. It's harder to drive them into these communal societies, these AI-run cities that they're going to claim are green cities and what we need to do for our environment. They want to eliminate nuclear energy. And the Green New Deal also calls for eliminating this nuclear power. I know people have questions about the safety, the cleanliness of the nuclear power, but so much of what have been taught as dirty energy is not necessarily dirty energy when you start to really weigh all the different pieces out. Again, the programming is designed to drive us into these socialist communal lifestyles, these technological cities that they want to have us in, because then they can fully control us in those cities. It's not about health. It's not about the environment. And I brought this up before. They want to eliminate 99% of the cars. That's going to affect everybody. So first, what we see already being implemented right now is this new tax on gas that's going to come and taxing people for the mileage that they drive. So they're trying to drive people out of the cars that they have now that are gas-based, and they want to move them into electric cars. They want to move them into electric vehicles, but to get electricity, you have to draw on some of these other energy sources there. So they're now magnifying the imprint instead of reducing the imprint, even though they want you to believe that they're reducing the imprint on things. And it's not going to affect just cars. When you start to do these things, this is going to come into replacing all kinds of forms of transportation, airplanes, boats, trucks, things like this. They're trying to make this happen within the next 10 years, actually not even that at this point, because they want it done by 2030. And they would like to see huge changes come into place by 2025. They want to gut and rebuild every building in America, and this is what they call moving them into sustainable cities, a state-of-the-art energy efficiency. See, they're going to try to pull on the heartstrings of the people who are environmentalists and say, we have to do this for the environment. This is about efficiency. This is about caring about the environment, and they're going to play some of those things in, but they're going to make everything be retrofitted. And we went through a phase of this, gosh, I want to say back in the 70s, the 80s, we went through a period of it. In the early 2000s, they had to go through and retrofit toilets and, different things like this to claim that we had to conserve these things. And it's all been, most of it's been a lie. I won't say every piece of it has been a lie, but a lot of it has been. And it's not about, again, that the conservation aspects were needed as much as it was about controlling people, about getting people to willingly comply with them, to get used to saying yes to whatever they presented, as long as they said it was for the greater good of things. They want to have, heating and cooling systems ripped out and replaced with other types of technology. And we've actually seen there's a lot of reports out, the huge damaging effects on people and rises in cancer when you're dealing with solar technology and other environmental damage that comes from the wind power turbines and things like this. So, we're still really not there. The so-called alternative green choices are really not better than what we have. And there's a lot of pieces to this. They're looking to eliminate air travel in this. And what they want to do is put in these high-speed rail systems. Well, that's going to get very interesting when you're talking about crossing oceans and things like that. And imagine what that's going to do if you're going to have to put up these rail systems going across the oceans and through the oceans. And those things, these high-speed rail systems are going to have to function on something as well. Now, my guess is that they want to try to incorporate this with the 5G, the 6G technology, and things like that, and that's part of why they want to push some of that through to allow for some of this technology. But they talk about the debt and the further cost of this, and This is leading to a fiscal, financial, disaster, really. So think about that. That's what we were just seeing in that clip that I showed right before this. And, you just think about all these things. Trains are going to go down. All kinds of forms of transportation are going to be alleviated. And if you're not feeding into that socialism thought, if you're not feeding into the CCP thought, you will not have transportation in your area. They're going to let the roads close up in many places. They're going to let these things shut down, and you won't be able to get certain resources. That's kind of where the Green New Deal is taking us. They want you to have a government guaranteed job. They're promising you, oh, look, we're going to give you these sustainable jobs. You'll work for the government, and you'll have all this stuff. And it's like, here again, it's all about control. It's controlling what you get. It's controlling your medical aspects. It's controlling every piece of your life. And sadly, there are people that will just willingly go with this and think that this is okay and think that they're doing something good and not realizing the destruction or the negative aspects that go along with just everybody being employed by the government. And, here again, it turns over control. If you don't want to do what the government does, so if you've got a communist structured government or you've got a socialist structured government, and then you don't want to comply with that train of thought, they just cut you off from everything. You get nothing. You get nothing. And so, then you're having to forage through things. They they just cut you off. They wipe all your resources out and everything. So it's all about trapping people. It's all about total control. This is one of the big things they'd like to say, look, you're going to have free education for life. Going to give you free college. We're already hearing that. The Biden administration's already talking about that. Free colleges. Kids won't have to pay for their school education anymore. Okay? This is right in part of the Green New Deal. Sure, that sounds good on the surface. Sure, give me a free education. They don't tell you the price that you pay for that. They don't tell you the strings that are attached to that. A salubrious diet, promising that the government is going to provide you healthy food. Well, this isn't true, because that healthy food means that they're going to shut down our farmers. They're going to shut down a lot of the grocery stores and the markets and the places that you shop. And they're going to tell you what you can eat, how much you can eat. It's going to be lab food. It's not going to be real meat. It'll be fake meat. Some of it is designed to where they will be breeding humans for meat, and that will be your meat. It's not this pretty picture that they're painting it out to be. A house. The Green New Deal promises that the government will provide you with safe, affordable, adequate housing for every American citizen. Okay? This is not going to be where you really get a house. This is going to be more like an apartment in a sustainable city, what they call a sustainable city. And again, you will get what they give you. You will get what they give you. You're not going to be able to necessarily live wherever you want to live. And again, this comes with all kinds of strings attached. You only get this as long as you are supporting their agendas, as long as you are supporting the socialist structure or the communist structure. That's the only way you get this. And you will own nothing. They won't allow you to own anything in this Green New Deal. They call it free money, and this is part of trying to transition into a digital system. They want you to believe you're going to have economic security, and that this is going to take care of anybody who's unable or unwilling to work. And here again, this is what that video was just showing. Get them on the welfare system, because when you have them there, you have total control. And then it's going to be about banning meat. And even Ocasio-Cortez admits that we can't get zero emissions in 10 years. You're never going to have zero emissions, because countries like China are never going to go to zero emissions. They're not going to cut back on things. they're not going to be taking these measures on things. They're not going to cut back on the manufacturing and the things that are the real issues and the real causes. And meat is actually not the real issues. It's the chemicals on the foods that the cows are digesting, which is causing the issues as far as that. And even that is not the part that's creating the greatest damage to the environment. It's the spraying in the air, it's the chemtrails that actually have the greatest impact on our environment. And so you can have a larger amount of certain things happening, but that's not it. So it's really also a way that they can just fund through one slush fund after another, supporting a lot of the corruption out there. So getting to some of this insanity of how they're infiltrating in and these crazy things that they are doing to get people to do the things they want. Krispy Kreme donuts came out, and they have a COVID vaccine offer. And here's the really interesting thing, you know, when you really get on it, what they are doing is they are giving people a donut a day if you get vaccinated. And you just have to have your card to show, and this will be going on for a year. They started it on March 22nd, so it'll run into like March 21st, March 22nd of 2022. And, you know, this is just another way, but think about this unhealthiness. Like, this is insanity. This is basically Krispy Kreme saying, hey, we subscribe to the CCP agendas and we subscribe to the socialist agendas, and we know that our donuts are going to break your brain down enough that you'll stop thinking for yourself if we give enough of them to you, and then you'll be even more programmable. And if you look at the way the vaccine works, the things that are fats like this, that have oils in them like this, lock in the microchipping technology and allow the shifting and the changing of the genes and the DNA structures in it. So it's really not what you think it is. You know, you get one free donut a day. That's what you can redeem on this for up to a year. And, you know, they have even aspects that you get one glazed donut per day. That's what you get on this. And, you know, you can't receive multiple ones or get them for other people. You have to show your card. Those people have to be present. But here's what they're doing. Even if you don't want to be vaccinated, you can go into Krispy Kreme, and once a week on Mondays, you can go in on Mondays for March 29th through May 24th, and receive a free original glazed donut and a medium brewed coffee to start your week off. Okay, this is one of those things of, look at how generous we are. So maybe if we give you this, and every time you come in and get that donut during this time period, then, you know, we'll just keep pumping you with our propaganda of how important it is to get a vaccine. And that's exactly what they're going to be doing with this. It's, you know, there's never just totally free things that are going on in this world. Now, the next insanity pieces that we see going on, which also shows the infiltration, are stories like this, where the police show up and visit an 82-year-old UK grandma because someone decided to report her for having a cup of tea. This is exactly how these socialist communist extremes do. They get people to rat on people. We saw this all through the pandemic last year. Tell on your neighbor because they didn't wear a mask. Report that business because they let somebody in that wasn't wearing a mask. You know, these tracking aspects and guilting people and reporting people, and people think, oh, look, I'm, you know, trying to help, but they're not helping. They don't realize what they're shutting down. And this poor lady, 82 years old, you know, she receives this visit from the police at like 9:45 at night or something like that. Yeah, 9:45 at night regarding the incidents. And again, those who see the Not the Bee do not confuse this with their other satirical site. They do have a parody site as well, but That's the Babylonian bee, is the parody site, but not the bee is real news that is just absurd and ridiculous kind of news that you can't even hardly believe it's true because it's that absurd. So, yeah, these police really showed up at this woman's house at 9:45 at night over this incident and came knocking at the door. And, you know, the poor lady, she didn't know who it could be. She thought maybe it was her daughter. She didn't hear well, and she thought they said, you know, it's me. So she opened the door to these officers, and they stood there with their mask on. One was a man, one was a woman, and they asked if they could come in and speak. And, you know, this is where they take advantage of our elderly, and they just kind of, you know, it's unbelievable. They asked her for identification, and she trusted the uniform, but obviously she was frightened. Obviously she had been in bed. She was, you know, not totally awake when they come knocking on her door. This woman who's not apparently had any trouble with the police before, and you know, here they are threatening this woman, saying if this happens again, you're going to be fined. And all she did was have a cup of tea with a neighbor or a friend without a mask on, and she was outside when they had the cup of tea. It wasn't even, I mean, this is crazy things that we're doing. And, you know, all she had was an out-of-date driver's license. The poor woman doesn't even drive, you know. But this harassment doesn't stop. This is the way they come in. This is the way they come in and do these infiltration. Taking a look in Seattle, we had fire department paramedics going door to door at adult care homes. So these adult care homes, again, preying on the innocent, carrying their vaccine, saying, hey, we're here to vaccinate you. We're here to get this shot in your arm. And this is part of this forced distribution. Again, catching people that they know probably aren't aware. They don't realize what's happening. They think they're, you know, struck the jackpot or something because they're going to have access to this. And this is a really dangerous thing, because what's the precedence that we're setting here? That these people can just go to your door and vaccinate you like you don't have a choice, and they don't even inform you you've really got a choice. They don't even talk to you about the option to say no. And here again, they're preying on the elderly. They're preying on the elderly with this thing. We had another incident. Tennessee Department actually came out and they said, you got to beware of vaccine scams, because, you know, here you had in Seattle these ones where they were legitimate, but then you've got these ones here where you have other people that they don't have legitimate vaccines, or they're trying to get into people's homes. They're trying to scam them in different ways. They're trying to charge them money for things. And, you know, again, who knows what kind of risk you can put somebody at. I mean, this could be somebody's life. You know, they might be, even if they're not giving a legitimate shot, they could, you know, if they were putting a sugar thing in and somebody's diabetic, I mean, that could be lethal. You know, different things that they're doing. So, you know, definitely using this caution, but it just shows this coercion, this level of coercion, this way of infiltrating in. We also had an incident that came up here in Shanklin in the UK, and this was a door-to-door vaccination, and they had to go through apologizing because there were concerns about it, and there were people, you know, raising questions about it. And good for them for raising questions about it. But here again, you know, thinking some people called it out as a scam. Well, apparently it did turn out to be real again, and they were looking at the elderly individuals that were going on there. But it's really amazing, again, how people just jump onto things when these crises are there, and they realize how vulnerable people are and how their mind isn't always thinking clear. And they always strike on the vulnerable groups first, the people who really can't defend themselves. And that goes, what, right hand in hand with our gun laws, where take the guns away. They can't defend themselves. It's the same concept. This is just a different version of it, is what's happening. And this is kind of a fun little thing. I'm going to show this little video as I wrap up with you on this third part of this series of a triple threat for America, because, you know, really, this is intense information. We've been delving into a lot of intense information in this series, and a lot of information to absorb in. So I thought maybe this would be a little bit lighter and talking about, a different form of infestation, infiltration, let's say. Some mountain goats infested the town of northern Wales, and this was after the lockdown started. This article came out March 22nd, actually, and it's from the NTD news site, a little clip that they put out here. And I'm just going to let you enjoy this as we start to wrap things up.
I don't see why it's a problem, really, as long as they're, not harming anyone.
I don't know if they're dangerous enough, but I would like to go ahead and
Llandunda, Wales' newest residents seem to think they have as much right to be there as anyone else.
Hey, I was driving, they were all in the road, and they just don't move.
They may be trying to earn their keep by doing public works.
And we've got a little bay tree, for example, and he comes in and he trims it, or they trim it into a nice little pom-pom for us. It saves us having to do it.
Great Orme wild goats normally live in the mountains, but have now started venturing into town as their numbers grow. Normally the government works to control the population.
And we do that through a contraception program, and that involves rounding them all up. It takes some effort. Lots of volunteers get together to do it and to look at the female goats.
Because of the pandemic, it was impossible.
So they have been breeding like goats.
After the lockdown started, 30 goats started venturing into Llandunda for food. Over time, some of the goats have gotten more daring, even appearing outside of the magistrate's court. It's thought they may return to the mountains for breeding season. Sapphire Quarter, NTD News.
So a little bit of the fun here, and the last thing that I'm going to do to wrap things up on here, and let me just kind of shift my screen back a bit here, and I'll come back into focus with you so that I'm not sharing my computer at this point. And as we come back in, I just want to give you a little bit of insight on some of the codes of these different things that we've talked about here. To start with those 4 steps that we talked about: the demoralization, the destabilization, the crisis, and the normalization. And when we look at the aspects of demoralization, that is really based on stirring up trouble. That is really based on upheaval that comes about, being rebellious, creating the rebellion energy. And when we demoralize, we place people in victim spaces, right? And then the victims eventually are going to rebel, or you create that movement and that narrative that they need to rebel. So it's really stirring up a rebellion from a code perspective. The destabilization piece of things comes into in codes that shows us that that's the phase that is actually separating us from ethics, from morality, from faith, from hope, from opportunity, from being connected to God. And so when you're destabilizing, that's exactly what we see when in that process, is that we see people's faith shaken. We see things crumbling in a way that people start to feel like they are unsafe, or they can't protect themselves, or aspects like that. It's also a time in the code patterns we see that that is something that destabilization phase is oftentimes connected to health issues. So it oftentimes will connect to a so-called pandemic, or releasing a virus, or having a public health issue come up, and they'll oftentimes use that as part of the destabilization. And the codes show that. You break down the health, you also disconnect from the soul, from the God, from the spiritual aspects that keep people thinking clearly and keep people in a space to be able to fight. So they weaken the physical system, they weaken the spiritual system in the destabilization from a code perspective. Now the codes, when we look at crisis, is the upheaval phase. This is the phase where you hit somebody with something unexpected, and that's exactly how they use the pandemics. That's exactly how they use these outbreaks and these pieces that come through, or they might, the codes even show this connecting to natural disasters or weather. So they will implement using like HARP technology to influence the weather patterns and to work from that aspect, so that they will, again, create this upheaval in people, put them into a state of trauma. That's what the crisis stage is about. So it's always interesting to me to see how these codes are correlating with the more traditional terms of things. Then in normalization. Normalization is a very interesting one because it's about making people believe they have freedom when they have actually had their freedom removed from them. And that can be a really crazy, challenging piece, because that's the piece where people feel like, oh, look, we're getting back to normal. Oh, look, they're maybe opening a restaurant now. Oh, look, we can go do this again. What they don't realize is, again, all these executive orders, all these bills are being put into place, and they're really not getting normal back. They're really not doing that, but they want people to believe it. So it's kind of an illusion. It's kind of the Trojan horse. It's the Trojan horse. It's the great deception of where people believe they're getting something great and they can have these experiences and be free again when they're not at all. It's actually an attack on freedom. When we look at the codes for infiltration, infiltration is always used, well, the codes connect to teaching, to learning, to making people believe that they're creating success while you're actually tearing that success down. It's actually bringing things to stagnation under the belief that there is victory or movement happening. And of course, the teaching factor can go a lot of different directions, right? If you could have positive infiltration, where you're infiltrating people's minds with positive things, with loving things, with connecting them to their soul self. But of course, when we're looking at it in the context of like a CCP infiltration, then you're actually dealing with destroying the ability to know or to learn or to teach them things that are negative that support the success of an organization like the CCP. And so when you combine the two of those together, infiltration becomes about stress when we specifically connect it to the CCP and what the codes are there. Now when we look at the new Green Deal in regards to codes, what we find out about is the codes show us this is all about greed, all about materialism, all about creating jealousy of people. And they're doing it under the guise of making people think they're all going to have the same thing, they're all going to be equal, but it's not. Because what's going to happen is this is going to make the elite richer. It's not going to create equality because you're going to have the elite, you're going to have people like the CCP, and then you're going to have people. And about the only thing it's going to do is wipe out the middle class. You're not going to get this utopian lifestyle that they're trying to make you believe that you're going to have, because they're going to continue to work by division. They're going to continue to try to block you from any divine connection. Then they're going to, in a sense, kind of isolate you and stagnate you to where you can't do whatever you want, and then they're going to keep you in turmoil. They're going to keep you under threat of survival, threat of being able to take care of yourself. And no matter how much they keep cutting you down to a harder and a harder lifestyle, they're going to keep taking more. And they're never going to believe that you've suffered enough under the codes of what the new Green Deal is. So that's kind of our code perspectives. That's kind of the wrap up on all of this. And I really appreciate everybody hanging in there with me, because I know this is a super long series and these have been some long aspects. And the last thing I want to wrap up with is, again, the Code Journey book is the book that I put out every single year that brings in these incredible insights about what's happening in our world and what is going on, and it opens up to showing you the opportunities of where we can operate in foresight and opening up these possibilities to help you really see, okay, here's what we can do. And you can pick up this book, by the way, on my website on the Goods tab at compassioncodes.com. And that's where you can pick up your own copy. It's got insights for each day of the year, for the months, for angel cycles on it, for portals that we have going on, the lunar cycle energies, as well as the year, what's going on with our star seeds, our generational groupings, and the influences those are going to bring in. And that actually opens us up to understanding as well the world events and some of the things that are going on. I know it's helped me to understand when I maybe need to have a little extra stock up on food on hand, or when I can ease up, or when I need to stay away from certain areas or certain situations. And that's kind of where the book guides and helps. And with that, I want to, again, just thank everybody and appreciate you for hanging in there. And definitely give your comments. Do you like these? Do you like these big digs to delve a little deeper into understanding things? Share it in the comments. Share it out with other people so you can help them understand what's really going on as well. Give them that opportunity to see what's really happening in our world. And go ahead, click like, click subscribe, you know, put the comments in there, and you know, make sure you hit the little bell so you get the notifications on there, and you'll be notified of new videos that come out. And take care, everybody, and hopefully I'll be back with you next week, or not next week, but like next month, because I try to put these out every month, and I look forward to connecting with you then.